welcome to Critical Thinkers in Religion, Law, and Social Theory. We are running just a tiny bit late, but we usually wait for people to arrive, but the room is full, so we might have to camp out on the floor if anyone else arrives. I want to thank my co-organizers, André de Liberté, Pascal Fournier, Elke Winter, and Sonia Sika. André and Sonia are here. The series is normally mostly funded by the Canada Research Chair in Contextualization of Religion in a Diverse Canada, which is a research chair that I hold. But I'm really happy to say that this particular talk has been co-sponsored by the Centre for International Policy Studies. So I'd like to thank everyone there who's been so incredibly helpful in not only financially supporting Beth's talk, but also in promoting the talk and in giving some public space through blog conversations and so on. So the Centre has been phenomenal in that regard. So thank you, and I don't actually know who you are, so thank you. Thank you very, very much. And then also thank you to Stephen Tomlins, who's on the video camera, Marianne Aboud Hamad, who is somewhere, no, she's not here, but she helped us set everything up. Karen Henri, who I think also is not here, and she too was involved in the organization of this. And last but not least, Heather Shipley, who's the project manager for the Religion and Diversity Project, that's sort of also involved in setting this series up. So without further ado, and I'll be relatively brief in my introduction as I always am, I'd like to introduce our speaker today, Elizabeth Shakman Hurd from Northwestern University. Her title talk is Believing in Religious Freedom, and she's an associate professor of political science at Northwestern University. And I've just come from teaching my graduate class where the students were actually reading her book, The Politics of Secularism in International Relations, which was published by Princeton in 2008. And they were extremely engaged, as was I. I've read through the book several times, and some of Beth's ideas in that book, I think we'll hear some of those transported into the talk today on religious freedom. She's also the co-organizer of The Politics of Religious Freedom, Contested Norms and Local Practices, which is a 3-year study of legal and political contestation surrounding religious freedom and the rights of religious minorities in South and Southeast Asia, the US, the Middle East, the European Union, and that's funded by the Lutz Foundation. So her reach is quite broad, as you can see, global in scope. Without further ado, I'd invite you to help me to welcome Elizabeth Shakman Hurd.
Thanks everyone. Can you hear me in the back? Yes. Yes, good. If you stop being able to hear me for some reason, please let me know. And if I'm going too fast, please take something from that reception table and throw it at me, because I have a tendency to talk fast. So it's great to be here. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for hosting me. It's such a wonderful opportunity. I've never given a talk in Canada before. So my husband's from Ottawa, and he was joking with me I needed to brush up on my Canadian. So we'll see how I do. But it's really, truly a pleasure to be here. So thank you all for coming. Thanks so much. Okay, so in the US, let me see if I want to now. We'll wait on that. In the US, religious freedom is described as the first freedom. It is understood to be a fundamental human right, a sine qua non of modern democratic politics, if not of civilization itself. People don't joke about religious freedom. We are told, Americans, that we invented it and we perfected it. And now it's ready for export. And exporting it, we most certainly are. A rapidly escalating number of actors are promoting religious freedom across state borders today. There is enormous excitement about the potential of formalizing and bureaucratizing religious freedom promotion. Legal guarantees of religious freedom are embedded as riders in trade agreements, in aid and assistance packages, and in humanitarian projects all over the world. The EU is promoting religious freedom in its external affairs programming, adding clauses to trade agreements with North African and Central Asian trading partners that will guarantee these partners' commitment to religious freedom. In Brussels, initiatives to train EU diplomats in religious freedom promotion are in the works, and the EU, as we speak, is drafting official guidelines on the subject. I'm heading over there next month to discuss this with them. At the UN, the Human Rights Office is in its third decade of promoting religious freedom and has recently initiated a campaign to combat incitement to religious hatred. This office is led by the Special Rapporteur on Religion of Freedom or Belief, appointed by the UN Human Rights Council. It focuses on ensuring state compliance with international human rights norms and standards developed roughly over the past 60 years. I won't list them all. Last but not least, foreign policy establishments are gearing up to promote religious freedom. The most recent example is, of course, Canada, where your Prime Minister Harper announced in spring 2011 that his government will be creating an Office of Religious Freedom at the Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade, which I think goes by DFAIT, right? Okay. And this office is to be explicitly modeled on the American office in the State Department, which has been promoting religious freedom abroad for 14 years. And here are some of the hot spots. So, the promotion of religious freedom is ubiquitous. It is not only evangelicals. An impressive array of institutions and public authorities across the political spectrum, secular and religious, has taken up this cause. Religious freedom is becoming a language used to garner international political legitimacy. The right to religious freedom is becoming what Laila Abu-Lughod calls a dialect of universality. Religious freedom, one could say, is being disseminated through international institutions and practices so that it is to some extent everywhere, translated, resisted, vernacularized, invoked in political struggles, made the standard language enforced by power. This is how I became interested in it. Like human rights, religious freedom has captured the field of emancipatory possibility. It is the answer to every question today. It stands in for the good and the right in many difficult and often violent situations. So in all of this excitement surrounding religious freedom as a universal norm, who on earth could be against religious freedom? It's easy to forget that these projects undertaken in the name of religious freedom are indeed political projects. They are indeed situated in history. They are implemented by particular powerful state and international authorities. It's very easy to be swept away in the common collective sense that if we guarantee religious freedom, we will be safe. We will be safe from pre-modern political orders based on tyrannical forms of religious authority that leave women and minorities in the dust. Who would want that? When religious freedom is positioned as it is as the alternative to these extremely unappealing options, it is not all that surprising that religious freedom and the projects that operate in its name have gathered this extraordinary momentum. So today I'm going to step back from the excitement and the anxiety surrounding the promotion of religious freedom. I am going to suggest that the promotion of religious freedom is not simply about spreading a beneficent, universal norm and legal standard. Instead, what we have here is a site of politics. And we have a site, indeed, of religious politics that we need to think very carefully about and consider. Specifically, I will suggest that religious freedom advocacy and religious freedom more broadly as a way of organizing how we see the world, as a discursive frame, that this advocacy actively politicizes religious difference, that it often masks complex political realities on the ground, that it often obscures diverse and multi-form religious realities as they are actually lived and experienced. So the insistence on legalizing and the top-down promotion of religious freedom brings into being a world, a particular kind of world. It helps to create a world in which religious difference becomes a little bit more salient politically rather than less. It helps to draw some lines between communities, horizontally and hierarchically. Not that the lines were non-existent before, but it nudges in a certain direction, defines and shapes what it means to be religious, what it means to be free. And in the process, religious freedom shapes and constrains political realities and religious possibilities on the ground. And this is what brings me to working at the intersection of politics and religious studies as I do. This leads us to a question, a very paradoxical question. Does religious freedom promotion actually promote religious freedom? I'll begin with the conflict in Syria. What kind of political and religious world does religious freedom promotion create in Syria? In other words, what do we see when we view the war in Syria through the lens of religious freedom? How does this framing then affect that conflict itself? So I'm going to talk about that first. Then second and finally, I'm going to ask, given these complicated considerations, is a world created by religious freedom a place in which we want to live? If it's not, is there any alternative? So first, Syria. We good in the back? All right. Calls for the protection of persecuted Christians in Syria, and in fact all around the Middle East in the wake of the so-called Arab so-called Spring, have been a cornerstone of religious freedom advocacy, particularly in U.S. foreign policy circles, but not exclusively. There are very serious concerns here, and we need to look carefully and pay close attention to the plight of minorities in the region. What I want to do is look more closely at how the problem has been framed and the specific consequences of framing the crisis in Syria in terms of religious freedom. And I will ask you to consider a paradoxical possibility, which is that framing the problem, and now the war in Syria, as a crisis of religious freedom may create the very problems that religious freedom purports to solve. This is a complicated story. So a couple of background examples. Christian Solidarity International, Joe Eibner at CSI has lobbied President Obama to urge Ban Ki-moon to declare a genocide warning for Christians across the Middle East. There's been enormous talk in Washington around this issue. Howard Berman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee says that the future of minorities is, quote, on our agenda as we figure out how to help these countries, end quote, and their treatment of Christians and other minorities is a, quote, red line that will affect future aid. Habib Malik of Lebanese American University has called for Western nations to stand up for the rights of Christians, who, he says, may be cleansed from lands where democratic elections are used to oppress minorities rather than to empower them. Malik says that this must be done in a way that's not misperceived on the other end, but, he concludes, the West must not be cowed. USA Today has reported that according to Christian rights groups, Christians in Syria, where Muslims have risen up against President Assad, have been subjected to murder, rape, and kidnappings in Damascus and rebellious towns. So the momentum builds, and the apparent logic of the story is clear. As USA Today reported, when Muslims rise up against Assad, in other words, when the Muslim majority populations of the Middle East are left to their own devices and are no longer held in check and repressed by the secular autocrats that we have supported for decades, the result is Christian persecution. That is the logic of the story. But of course, the problem here is that the Syrian protests, like other protests in the region, are simply not captured by the notion, by the sentence, Muslims rising up against Assad. This is how the regime wants us to hear the story. This is indeed the regime's story, and it has been for decades. For decades, as you know, the Assads, both of them, have relied on the threat of sectarian anarchy that is lurking just below the surface, ready to explode, to justify and maintain their autocratic rule in Syria. When the media, when government officials, when public figures all reinforce this framing, the regime's framing of the war, as a sectarian conflict pitting Sunnis against Alawites and their Shiite allies, it makes sectarian violence more rather than less likely. It energizes divides between Christian, Alawite, and Sunni. It brings these identities to the surface, puts them at the top of people's list, accentuates them and aggravates them. We saw similar dynamics in Bosnia in the 1990s, been written about by David Campbell. So when religious difference, in other words, becomes the primary lens through which complex social, political, economic, and religious conflicts, when it becomes the primary frame for understanding these conflicts, I'm arguing that sectarian conflict is exacerbated. This approach fortifies categories of difference, Christian, Alawite, Sunni, that might not otherwise necessarily define what indeed did begin as a popular uprising against a secular autocrat.